Hey, do you ever feel like that Sunday to Sunday cycle has you like a hamster on a wheel? Well, we want to change that hamster wheel into a flywheel that's generating momentum for your church moving forward towards your vision. Stick with us this week on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball, joined as always by my good friend, AJ Matthew. And today we are brought to you by Faith Street. Faith Street is an iOS and Android app that brings congregations together, helps strengthen people's commitment to the church and to each other, that builds community by prompting prayer, mindfulness, generosity, reflection, fellowship, and teaching as daily practices. And our listeners get 20% off, can get 20% off. So go to faithstreet.com/Malphurs. That's faithstreet.com/Malphurs, MALPHURS, for 20% off. Check it out. And AJ, glad to be with you today on the podcast, talking about planning, creating a strategic planning rhythm. I think, full disclosure, AJ, I think this topic was maybe not something that you thought is going to be the most exciting type topic. Is that fair to say?
You're outing me from our planning meetings now when I say, I don't know, Scott.
like it's not the most, people are probably not just, man, I can't wait to learn about planning.
Yeah,
I think you're probably right. But I hope to prove both you, AJ, and maybe any cynical or skeptical listeners wrong today. That I think that planning is something that can unlock the potential of your church. As you said in the teaser there, AJ, let's turn that hamster wheel into a flywheel and get some momentum for your church.
Well, yes. So hopefully our listeners, viewers are as open-minded as I was in our planning meeting. Because look, we had a meeting to plan, Scott. We at least are doing something, and we planned an episode, and now we're executing it. Do what we do, right. Plan and execute. But this is one of those things. This is like leadership development. Like every leader knows I should be building into my leaders because it'll pay off in the future. And then you get busy and you're like, I just need to get this done. Same thing with it. Same thing with planning. Like everybody knows it's good to plan. That way we're ready for things, and we can actually get maybe more done than we get done right now. But then you're busy and you just don't want to do it. So this is in that same genre. And so I hope you'll stick with us here for the next half hour or so, and we'll talk through this and maybe be able to show you why this will benefit your church and be an encouragement to you to actually take it on.
Yeah, it's about creating a planning habit or a planning rhythm. And some of us are not geared towards wanting, we don't necessarily like having those structures in our lives where we have these habits. We like to just go with the flow. We like to be open to new experiences and new things. And I'm actually in that camp. I'm that kind of person. I'm on the Enneagram. I'm a 7 wing 8. So I like for my days to not all be exactly the same. And so I can relate to that. But I've seen the power that a good planning rhythm brings to a church and the results that you're able to achieve because you were intentional. And without that intentionality, it's just not possible. And you become a slave to whatever's most urgent, or whatever wheel is squeakiest, or whatever problem is causing you the most pain, and you're not able to think down the line a little bit, where you're actually preventing problems upstream. And you're not able to gain momentum as a church. So I do think that there's a case to be made, even if you're a person who likes to fly by the seat of your pants like I am, that if you are to take on the discipline of achieving a planning rhythm, a strategic planning rhythm in your church, you're going to see results in your church that you never would see otherwise. And I want to make the case, AJ, because I think this would maybe be an objection that people have is that planning is not biblical.
Oh yeah.
That we're turning it into a business or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just like to contend that this is not the case. That God's made a plan for all space and time. And he's been working that plan for a long time. And aren't you glad that God has a plan? I am. And if we believe that God has a plan, there's certainly nothing unholy about you having one.
Yeah, most certainly. That could be a whole episode in itself. We say that every week. We always come up with an idea and then we don't write it down, Scott. And then we end up coming up with other ideas. So we should write down
for sure
the ideas that we have mid-episode. But yes, planning. God is a God of planning, no doubt about it. He had you in mind before the creation of the world. And so we're only asking you to go out a few years. So come on.
That's right.
You can get that done.
And believing that God is present in the planning, right? We certainly don't want to plan around God or be controlling. These are legitimate concerns and fears, like that we're trying to control our lives or control things and not invite God into the process. But we can invite and should invite the Holy Spirit into the planning process itself. And so
100%.
That's sort of an underlying assumption within what we're going to lay out for you today, is that it would be every part of this bathed in prayer and with the invitation of the Holy Spirit to be a part of every step of this process. So
yeah, I think another possibly unintended positive consequence is that, and I think, Scott, in our experience, it is not the forte of a lot of pastors to be long range planners or getting into a rhythm of doing that, and even maybe working well in a team that is all planning together. Mm-hmm. But most likely you have more than one board member, council member, elder, deacon board, whatever it might be, or staff that are more planners than you are. And if you can begin to develop this skill and work with your teammates on long range planning, you're probably going to get more out of them. They'll help you get more out of yourself. And that, again, helps build the momentum. In addition to just having the plan over periods of time, it's going to help you build more momentum because you're going to see a greater amount of work getting done amongst your team.
Yeah. So obviously there's lots of we could go into in terms of planning and everything that goes into it. The focus of today's episode, AJ, is on the rhythm.
Yeah.
What should the pacing be and what should be done when? And so we have sort of 5 moments, sort of calendar type planning moments where we would say, here's when planning needs to happen and here's what needs to happen within each of those moments. So we're going to dive into that now and kind of explain the 5 sort of moments of strategic planning to build that rhythm.
Yeah. So number 1, this is setting the baseline. We call it essentials. We have a process called strategic envisioning, and we walk through these 5 components to create the baseline for moving forward in the church. And it involves planning out a big vision impact for several years, and then all of the pieces that you would need in place for your church to be healthy to get to that long range big vision impact. So here in our first component, our long range plan has 5 things inside of it, and we can break these down, Scott. But it's got mission, your core mission, your mandate in the church, your core values, what motivates you, and what is going to cause you to perform certain things in the church, your discipleship pathway. How are you going to organize your ministries so that your church makes sense? The effort that you're putting in makes sense for particular outcomes. What's your vision? What's the big thing that you believe God has called you to do there in your particular place and time? And then finally, strategies. How are you going to achieve all those things? This makes up the framework of our long range plan. You could do this on your own. There's a lot of resources out there. You can work with a guide on that. And of course, you can work with the Malfers group on strategic envisioning to set this baseline for you. But Scott, we want to hit on each of these points.
Yeah, briefly. Yeah, AJ, I think the word you used a second ago is perfect. This is sets the baseline. So churches often want to just jump into strategies. Mm-hmm. Here's some changes that we can make without having thought about all of these essentials components of church health, these essential components of church health. And so if it's been 10 years since your church has looked at your mission or these other issues, then it's time to go back to that. So I would advocate about every 5 years, approximately, you want to go through these things. Now, does that mean you're going to be rewriting your mission statement every 5 years? Of course not. But what tends to happen is over time, we get mission creep, AJ, right?
Yep.
Where we know what the mission statement is, but we've started to walk away from that, or there are competing missions within the church that are taking up our time and attention. So about every 5 years, you want to, even if you're not writing a new mission statement, which again, I don't think you should do that every 5 years, you want to recommit yourself to that mission. On your core values, am I saying you're going to reestablish your core values every 5 years? Of course not. But if it's been 15 or 20 years since you've done it, you should, or maybe you've never done it. But every 5 years, you want to make sure there's not any unconscious values that are starting to creep up that are competing with the healthy values that you have. On your discipleship pathway, AJ, ministries have a shelf life.
Yeah.
And so the way that you've been doing things may not work. If it's been 5 years or more since you've taken a hard look at your ministries, the world has changed in the last year because of the pandemic. Odds are there needs to be some concerted refreshing of the way that you're doing ministry. And if you've not done that in a strategic way, you've just kind of duct taped things together to get through the pandemic, now's the time to go, let's think about this in a more strategic way. You mentioned vision, AJ, thinking through what does the next 5 years look like. I'm going to be weaving in maybe a little bit of a football metaphor, which I know is your favorite, AJ. But if you want to think about what's that end zone look like for us? What would a touchdown look like for us in the next 5 years? And it's once you define that, you can start working backwards on what progress we need to make. What are the first downs along the way that we need to make in order to get to that end zone? But if you don't know, I've been talking with a number of churches lately, AJ, that they simply don't know what a win would look like for them.
Yeah.
5 years from now, they don't know. And when you don't have that clarity of vision, you're going to have infighting and contention in the church. That's conflict.
No doubt about it. The lack of a long-term plan is open space. It creates a vacuum in which you could have competing missions and visions, unconscious missions and visions that have never been spoken, but that people are operating under. These are the kinds of things that we talk about when we work with churches and building unity in the church around common ideas is the big time goal. So yeah, that's the pieces of the long range plan. This is number one in the order today. So, and again, if it's been
15 years, if it's been never or 15 years, you need to start there.
That's right.
If you've done that recently, then you can kind of move on to the next chunk, but you should be doing this about every 5 years or so. That's not a hard and fast rule, but I wouldn't look at it. Some people, AJ, look at long range planning like a 10-year plan. I just don't think it's wise to make a 10-year plan. 10 years is a really long time to project out. So when you're building a long range plan, I advocate you should only try to project out 5 years, because that's about as far out as you can think and have any degree of accuracy.
Yeah.
So about 5 years or so is how often you should be doing sort of a more detailed long range planning.
So number two, we're stepping back a little bit closer and we're talking yearly. So we get what should we be doing every 5 years? Now, what should we be doing annually? And there's two things that we want to talk about on your annual plan, and that's refreshing your vision dashboard. That's a term that we use with our partner churches, but we're talking about what measures are you monitoring, and those might need to change over the course of a year. And then the second thing are your strategy projects. Again, this is part of our process, and that is making decisions based on your discipleship pathway, because these are the key things in the church you want everybody doing. So what are the projects we need to be doing to maximize our efforts in those areas of ministry? And so annually, we should set our sights on something that probably will take about a year to plan and execute and fully implement. And Scott's football analogy comes into play here, Scott, and that is 6 yards of progress. And we'll unpack both of these now. So first, refresh your vision dashboard.
Yeah. So I was actually just meeting with someone yesterday that astutely made this point, and I was so glad he said it, because I said this is a point I make all the time. What you choose to measure will impact what you choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
So if we choose strategies or take on projects independent of measures, then we're setting ourselves up maybe for not getting the vision outcome that we want to have.
Yeah.
So in strategic envisioning, we work backwards. So we'll start with, what is it that we're wanting to achieve over the course of 5 years? What's the church that we want to become? What's that end zone look like for us, AJ?
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of work our way back towards, okay, well, what would progress look like? How would we assess progress over the course of the next year? So obviously that needs to be refreshed annually. We would set what we call a vision indicator, but what would be that measurement? Or if you've worked in the business world, it's a little bit like a key performance indicator, a KPI. What is the indicator that we are making progress within a particular step in our discipleship pathway? And so you have to reassess that every year. One of the biggest mistakes that some of the churches we work with make is after a year, they don't update that. And that doesn't work. You have to refresh that every year.
Yeah.
Once you've set that win, AJ, you're then able to use those measurements to then select what would we need to do in order to make that progress. So if we want to hit that goal, what needs to change? So these projects, AJ, are over and above the normal course of operations. Right. This is not just running your ministries, just doing Sunday morning. These are ways in which you're aiming to improve. So you're looking for a key area of improvement in each step in your discipleship pathway. And I call it 6 yards of progress. The reason why Tom Brady is 97 years old and still winning Super Bowls is because he understands. I'm not really a Brady fan, but I respect greatly his approach. He understands that he doesn't have to throw the ball down the field, a Hail Mary on every play, or even most plays, or really any play. He understands that he needs to get 6 yards on this play, and 6 yards on the next one, and 6 yards on the next one. And he's never going to be in fourth down, and he's going to be in that end zone. And your church needs to take that same approach. What is the 6 yards of progress that you can make this year, and then the 6 yards the next year, and the 6 yards the next year? And before you know it, you've achieved that 5-year vision. You got to the end zone, and you never overextended yourself. This is the mistake that churches make, AJ. They overextend themselves in a short period of time, and they're not able to sustain change or sustain innovation over the long term. So only try to make 6 yards of progress so that you can do the same thing next year and the year after that.
Yeah, absolutely. Conserve your energy, work smart, and execute the play. That'll get you there. That was number two. Right. Number three is coming back a little bit shorter term again. And now we're talking quarterly. A couple of things to do quarterly: update action plans and identify what we've come to call tentpole moments. So action plans, Scott, probably our listeners, they're not presently going, oh yeah, right, action plans. I've got them right over here.
Yeah. So in your in that yearly planning that happens, we like to cap off a yearly plan with your first 90 days. Like, okay, so once we've decided on, here are the projects we're going to take on over the course of the next year. Okay, well, let's detail out for each of these projects, what's the first 90 days look like? So when you get past that first 90 days, that first quarter, now it's time to define the next 90 days. Mm-hmm. Now we have, and I'm not going to get into the weeds here, AJ, just for the sake of clarity, but we have a recommended rhythm, how we would say that each set of 90 days should follow a particular rhythm. But the details of that need to be clarified each quarter, because and this makes sense. What you did in the previous 90 days will influence what you need to do in the next. So it's impossible to, in January or whenever you're doing your yearly planning, maybe you're doing it, in the fall or something, but it's impossible when you're doing your yearly planning to know every action step you're going to need to take for the next year.
Yeah.
You can probably only get that detailed for the first 90 days. And so just by definition, every quarter you need to take time, usually takes about an hour and a half, to detail out what the next 90 days looks like in terms of action steps. We would also, encourage you to define what a deliverable is for each action step. So what's the proof of the work? Assign an owner who's going to actually take ownership of that task, and then a deadline. So when is it going to be due? I was recently had a meeting with a church, I'll say, where ownership was lacking. I asked who's in charge, and they said, well, none of us are really in charge. And I was like, well, then, and the whole reason why I was meeting with them is they hadn't gotten anything done, really. So like, there's no reason, no wonder no one's in charge. No one's taking ownership. So that's a key component of it as well.
Yeah. And then our tent pole moments. So you already have some natural rhythms in your church happening. And so these are going to help be some indicators for you and sort of break your year up as you go. So tent pole moments, Scott, and we got this from our buddy Jason Day over at Outreach when we had him on the podcast last year. And but I think this is kind of a good way of kind of thinking about our annual ministry rhythm as well.
Some of these sneak up on you every year, and some don't. Christmas never sneaks up on you because you know when it is. Easter shouldn't, although I would ask you, do you know right now when Easter is next year?
No, nobody does.
No, because the date always changes. So it is actually possible for Easter to sneak up on you if you're not really good at planning. I know that sounds crazy to some churches. You're thinking, no way. But trust me, some churches, it's like 3 weeks out and they're like, oh yeah, Easter is in 3 weeks. We got to get going. So if you intentionally have a quarterly planning meeting, AJ, you're able to then go look out over the course of the next 90 days, look at the calendar. And so the things that do sneak up on you, like Mother's Day, like Father's Day, like whatever. I mean, it could be your fall
Father's
outreach.
Day?
Huh?
Father's Day? Nobody's
Hey,
ever heard of
I'm
that.
trying to bring that out as a tentpole moment. Come on, dads, let's unite.
Wait a
Father's
minute.
Day.
I think it's in the summertime. We don't do church in the summer.
But whatever those things might be, National Back to Church Sunday, to give a shout out to Jason Day. Whatever these tentpole moments would be, if you have on your calendar a quarterly planning meeting, AJ, and one of your agenda items in that meeting is to identify those tentpole moments, they won't sneak up on you. 90 days is enough time to plan for almost anything. And so you can create sort of an action plan around it. Yep.
There you go. You might only have 2 tent poles. Maybe Christmas and Easter are really the only big things that your church is planning for right now. And it'd be a good opportunity then to take maybe the way you handle planning for those things and divide up the year into a couple of additional quarters for you. That was number 3. Absolutely. Number 4, here we are coming in a little bit closer again, monthly. And monthly, we're talking staff and volunteer teams. So again, we'll use a little bit of terminology that we've developed for, inside of our systems that we work through. We call these monthly implementation reviews. And so we've got the teams together. The big time work has been done. We've projected out what we're going to be working on this year. We've developed a rhythm now of quarterly functions, but every month we need to make sure that we're still making progress. And so our team, we call it a strategic leadership team inside of our strategic envisioning process. But in monthly implementation reviews, there's accountability built in at this point. We've gone a month, 30 days, and what work has gotten done. And we break this down into 4 things as well, Scott.
Yeah. So it's going to depend who would be a part of this meeting. Depends a little bit on the church, but as a general rule, this would be a combination of staff and volunteer teams. Yeah. So staff would be involved in this, and some volunteers would be involved in this as well. And in that monthly implementation review, for each of those projects that you have, the teams are going to kind of split up based on their project and ask what's been completed.
Mm-hmm.
Based on when things were supposed to get done, what's actually gotten done. Then we're going to look at what have we started or what are we about to start? What task have we started since our last meeting or we're about to start before our next meeting? Third, we're going to ask what's at risk. So what's at risk of falling behind? Thinking of that church that really fell behind. They obviously weren't, that group was not meeting the way that they were supposed to, because they would have seen what was at risk. They would have been able to figure out 2 months ago what was falling behind. But if you don't ask the question, what's at risk, then there's no accountability for catching up. So you really need to ask that question. And then finally, to me, this is maybe one of the most important things that happens in these monthly meetings is cross-functional communication. So how different teams can help each other. You want to make sure that two teams aren't trying to attack the same problem from different angles, unless that's intentional and on purpose. How can they work together? What resources do they need from one another? And so to prevent siloing, which is really common in churches, you want to be sure that there's a unified moment where all four, I said four, it could be 3, 4, 5, it doesn't really matter, but however many strategy projects you have going on, that those teams come together and communicate with each other so that you know what's happening, and not just give a report. That's, if you were just giving a report, AJ, you could send that in an email. Like, resist the urge to have meetings that could just be emails, but actually dialogue with each other so that you can have that cross-functional communication that's healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. Our last piece now takes us down into the weekly rhythm. And at the weekly rhythm, again, this is a little bit dependent on the size of your church, how much is happening at a staff level, how much is happening at a volunteer level. And weekly has to begin to interact with the regular weekly Sunday to Sunday things, in addition to any of these additional projects that are happening. So I also want to point out that, this rhythm that we're talking about and what we lay out for churches that work through the strategic envisioning process, nothing is ever created or added in that blows your week up. The shortest term major changes in the church are a year long. Now there might be some little pieces to those that, happen maybe within the first month or 90 days. But we don't ever create anything that blows up your week where you're like, I don't even know how I'm going to get ready for Sunday because of what this new process has added. It's only going to be very small incremental things on any particular week. And so you're able to fit.
That's why we call it 6 yards of progress, right?
Exactly. If you cannot find the bandwidth to do just a little bit of long-term strategic work throughout the course of a year, then there's probably something else already wrong in the way things are being handled within your team structure, within your ministry structure at the church. So, and that would be something that would probably be addressed throughout the process. So anyway, bringing us back into the week, Scott, we've got a couple of things here that we'll mention just in regards to staff and then also volunteer-led teams.
Yeah, so when you're running, well, first of all, I'd like to point out, even in churches that have multiple staff, I'm astonished at the number of churches that don't have weekly staff meetings. I encounter churches regularly that they meet every other week or whatever. Now, if you get into a situation where you have an extremely large staff, it's possible that you don't have all staff meetings every week. Like, I'm aware of churches
departmental, ministerial. Yeah,
it's more departmental. So I would understand that. But I'm talking about for a normative type church that's, 300 to 700 people. Those are the churches that usually have multiple staff. I'm not saying that's the normative size for churches. The normative size for churches is like 100 people. But for churches that have multiple staff, 3, 4, 5 staff, they're probably somewhere between 250, 600, 700, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Those churches should be having weekly staff meetings, not twice a month or once a month. They should be meeting every week. And when they meet, there's obviously a tactical side of things. So what's happening this week in specific ministries? So not specific to your strategic projects, but in regards to regular ongoing operations. So how many new people did we have show up this past Sunday? Where are we at in the communications process with those newcomers? How are things, all of the things that have to do with the regular business and ongoing operation of church ministries. So you might call this tactical stuff. Secondly, and this is really critical for you who are senior leaders, what is the strategic focus for the week? Because it's very easy for staff to get mired down or bogged down in tangential things that are not necessarily mission critical. And so what is the strategic focus? What is the win for the week? What's the most important thing that if something had to fall off, come off the rails for the week, what couldn't? What's mission critical? And that might be difficult for you to think through, but it's important to define because, again, in my experience in working with staffs and working on staffs, it's very easy let me give a concrete example, AJ. If we're looking at our tentpole moment of VBS, okay? We got VBS coming up. It's a all church, all hands kind of moment. If my student ministry guy is responsible for coordinating all of the activities, like the games and that kind of thing, all right? And so part of that is he needs to be recruiting volunteers who are going to run different stations. I'm just making something up off the top of my head, all right? Now, if student ministries guy gets bogged down, for some reason he gets it in his brain, man, that student ministry closet is a disaster. And he spends a whole workday cleaning out that closet. Is that the best use of his time? Probably not. Not if there's a due date coming up on getting those station leaders recruited. Mm-hmm. But this is the kind of thing that happens because it's very possible for staff people to become myopic. They go in there to get a Frisbee and they're like, oh, this thing's a disaster. And then before they know it, they've pulled everything out and they start organizing. So you want to set the strategic focus as the senior leader and go, the most important thing that you get done this week, student ministries guy, is be sure the station leaders are recruited for VBS. Now, if he has bandwidth beyond that and he wants to clean out a closet, go with God. But he knows that the most important thing that he has to get done, the strategic focus for him, is recruiting those station leaders. Does that make sense, AJ?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's really easy to fall into those traps.
Because what happens is then you kick the bucket to next week, or kick the can, I should say. Kick the bucket. It's done. Kick the can. You kick the can to next week. And when it's senior leadership's responsibility to set the tone and accountability. The most important thing that you get done this week is X. This is the win for us, right? Versus going, well, you get them next week. And then before you know it, it's 3 weeks away and you haven't gotten the leaders recruited and it's a problem.
Yeah.
And you look back, how did it happen? Well, I spent that 3 days cleaning out a closet, right? And that was not a good use of your time.
Yep. There you go. Yeah. And then finally, our volunteer teams, Scott, and we're actually not asking that much on a weekly basis. Now, you can't project out, well, I don't have that much to do this week, so every week I don't have that much to do. You still have deadlines, still have things that need to get done, but primarily volunteer teams they've got jobs and lives and families. They're not paid to participate in this stuff all day, every day. They do need to communicate well. And so that's what we have down primarily for our volunteer teams. Stay in clear communication with one another. And there has to be a team leader and there has to be team participants. So, what did we get done this week? Hey, Mary, you were going to be making this phone call, or you were going to see if you could source out that shade sale that we need for the playground. Were you able to get the pricing for that? Constant communication. Right. This is how volunteer teams, at the very minimum, will maintain a forward momentum by constantly staying in communication.
Yeah. In fact, you could go back and listen to an episode that we had with Bo Patterson. He talked about the number one thing that drives team performance is constant, clear communication. Mm-hmm. And so, what you don't want to have happen is they show up to the monthly implementation review and everything is behind because they're like, oh yeah, I forgot that I needed to get that done. So you're just, they don't have a ton of tasks that you're asking them to do from week to week, but they do have some tasks that you ask them to do. And so having good communication, I really recommend, this is a great time to bring up our sponsor, and leveraging Faith Street, something like that, where you can bring up things that way. You could also leverage something like Slack. You want to get away from email, AJ. Email is not the best way to communicate with your team generally, because it's easy for things to get lost. It's harder to sort things. People don't get copied on things. Attachments don't come through the right way. You get stuck in spam. These things happen. And so, find a better way than email to communicate with your team and to keep that communication going throughout the week.
Yeah, Faith Street is a good way for people to be able to communicate with one another and be able to cut out the other distractions that other mediums have.
Right. Absolutely. So on that note, you can go to faithstreet.com/Malphurs, get 20% off and check it out. faithstreet.com/Malphurs, MALPHURS. Little plug for them, but really you want to get away from email, AJ, as your primary communication platform with folks, because it's just too crowded by all the other things.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to briefly recap here before we wind things down for the episode, AJ, we have these 5 moments in strategic planning. 1, start with the baseline in your long-range plan. So if you've not ever done this, or if it's been 5 years or more since you've done it, it's time to do it. It's not enough for it to live in your head if you're the pastor. This is one thing I hear a lot. The pastor will go, well, I sat down and did this. If it wasn't a collaborative process, it's almost as if you didn't do it at all. Mm-hmm. So it's something you got to do with a team about every 5 years or so. Number 2, yearly planning. So in those years that you're not doing the full long-range planning, in those interim years, you want to refresh your measures for the year, and you want to select strategy projects, things that you're going to do over and above your regular course of operations, 6 yards of progress. Number 3, quarterly. So I want a distinction here I didn't make earlier, AJ. You basically want to plan on having a meeting once a month. These quarterly meetings are not an additional meeting. It's just one of those months is the quarterly review where you're looking further out. Does that make sense, AJ?
Yeah. So
it's not like we have our regular monthly meeting and a quarterly meeting. It's the same meeting, but once a quarter, the scope is wider than it would be in the regular monthly meeting.
Sure.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
And in that quarterly review, you're updating action plans because hopefully you will have accomplished all of the things that you had set out to do the previous quarter. And you're identifying any tentpole moments that you need to plan around for the next 90 days. 4th is the monthly implementation review. This would be a combination of staff and volunteers coming together to work through these projects, seeing what's completed, what needs to get done, and achieving that cross-functional communication. And then finally, weekly. This is primarily for staff. I would not expect volunteer teams to meet weekly. In fact, that would be a really poor idea. You don't want to have more frequent than monthly volunteer team meetings. Yeah. But weekly meetings for staff that are tactically focused, and that provide a strategic focus from senior leadership to the staff. Say, this is the most important thing for you to get done. And then also weekly, it's really daily, that constant clear communication and feedback with your volunteers, so that when you come to that monthly meeting, the things that there's no surprises. You kind of know what's been going on, but it gives you an opportunity to rally together. So, man, AJ, I've worked on church staffs and I've worked with church staffs that have used this kind of a rhythm, and I don't. There's no way for folks to know the value of this until they actually do it.
I agree, because working with churches that have had something at least close to this, right from the jump on when we're doing, kind of our baseline work on the long-term plan, they're already thinking, oh, I know how we're going to be able to execute this because we've got these habits and these systems in place for meeting and getting things accomplished. And so this is one of those things that is worth the effort to form a habit. And but the benefit, is that you're not by yourself. I mean, you pull your team together and go, you know what, we need to be able to do things better and more efficiently. Let's create this together and hold each other accountable to it and just start doing it. And you'll immediately begin to see the benefits of it. And I think it's going to raise the performance level of yourself and your team in a very short period of time. You'll wish you had done it sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. So check out today's show notes at malfersgroup.com/85, just the number 85, malfersgroup.com/85. Thanks again to our friends at Faith Street for sponsoring today's episode. It's a great platform for creating discipleship as a habit and not just an event, and creating that communication between your church leaders and your congregation, and building those really important habits of prayer and reflection, and building that community online in a way that's not on Facebook, that you're not reliant on some big company in California to be the host for your digital online community. So check out Faith Street and see if it's a fit for your church. faithstreet.com/Malfers. You'll get 20% off. faithstreet.com/Malfers, MALPHURS. AJ, thanks for joining me on today's episode. I hope we lived up to the hype of what this episode could be.
What a great episode. See you next week.
We'll see you. Have a great week.